Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Josh Rundlett from Rundlett Performance and Machine. Here today we are working on Speed King's motorcycle, better known as Big Bertha. Big Bertha is getting a 131 kit. This 131 kit was supplied to us by SNS Cycle. SNS Cycle was generous enough to let us play with this. So we're pretty excited today. We're getting ready to essentially play with some new products that have been released, what do you suppose, Steve, a couple months now?
Yep.
So a couple months out, and so we get to play with this. So today we're going to actually assemble the 131 kit. The motorcycle will not be ready to fire up today, but we are going to assemble the engine. And so we're going to have a little fun with this today. We're going to start by, we already have the crankshaft out, or the old crankshaft out of the old cases. We've already got the cases clean. We got the bearings ready. We're ready to start assembling now. We also have this new SNS 4 5/8 crankshaft. Now, this crankshaft, we decided that we do not want to run the balancer, so we asked for them to leave the balancer gear off. The reason that we're leaving the balancer off is, one, its weight. It's a boat anchor. It's not needed. The motorcycle is also rubber mounted. This motorcycle will spin up faster without the counterbalancer in it, so we're not going to run it. This is our lovely boat anchor we removed today. See, pretty bulky, heavy. Why have extra spinning components that are not needed in this engine, especially when we want to make power? So, with no further ado, we're going to start assembling. All right, guys, now that we have the new crankshaft installed in our cases, we've sealed the cases, we have bearings installed, seals installed, bearings are lubed and ready to go. SNS sends us Torco assembly lube. This stuff works great, so we use it all over the engine. That's why they send you a whole tube instead of just a few drops. So we've got the bearings all pre-lubed and ready to go. We want to make sure that our crank moves freely, and it does. There's no binds, there's no flaws. We're ready to start assembling. Now, like I said, you follow the torque pattern per Harley-Davidson specs through service manuals, okay? You follow the bolt pattern, follow its torque procedure, and now your cases are essentially torqued and ready to go. Now, what we're getting ready to do now, that I personally like to do, is I like to assemble my cam chest next. So instead of jumping to cylinders and pistons right away, we're going to get the cam chest assembled first. Then we'll move on to pistons and cylinders and heads and things of that nature. SNS sent us a 550 SNS camshaft to run with this kit. So we're going to install it currently. And then we're also going to install SNS's billet, oil pump, and cam support plate. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start getting all these parts prepped and ready for assembly. All right, guys, so now that we have our cam support plate installed, our billet oil pump, and our 550 SNS camshaft, SNS also sent us their new billet tensioner. So we just want to show this product real quick before we install it. This product is very, well, it's a lot more robust than the factory one. The factory one is made out of cast. It's got this big hinge on it. It's considerably different. Now, this one's all encased in aluminum, big shoe. This one has, in my opinion, a weak point with this plastic hinge. and this hydraulic arm constantly pushing on it. Now everything is encased in a track. It goes back and forth. Should last longer and handle the extra performance that we're putting to this engine. All right, guys, so now we're getting ready to look at our Sns Pistons. Our Sns Pistons actually are located with front and rear setups, okay? They're actually labeled on top of the piston. Cam side, meaning face towards your cam's chest. Forward with an arrow. Now, there's a cutaway to have rod clearance and piston clearance as it comes to bottom dead center. And so a lot of these associations in these pistons are very critical that you get them in the right location. If you don't, you could have catastrophic engine failure. Now, the next thing we have to do before we go much further is we need to now measure our ring end gap. It's very rare that companies send out rings without having the ring end gap correct. So we have to take the cylinder or the piston ring, we're going to set it inside the cylinder, and then we're going to measure the gap with a set of feeler gauges, okay? Now, this particular top ring needs some minor adjustments to it. Nothing too major, to be honest with you, but needless to say, it still does need some adjusting. All right, we now have plenty of clearance for said piston. So now we'll leave those rings with that piston and cylinder set up because that's what we cut it with. And then we'll move on to the next cylinder and repeat the same process. We've got our cylinders and pistons installed. We're ready now to start messing with the cylinder heads. Now, with this SNS kit, we have a few things that we need to do to the cylinder heads before we reinstall them. And the first thing we need to do is change the valve springs. The 550 camshaft, it requires new valve springs. Also, in doing so, we also need to install our lovely little hardware kit that blocks off the oil hole that is in the cylinder head. That block off area, if you do not cap it, you run the risk of leaking engine oil out of the head gasket.